a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Organic Man Coffee Trike makes the best coffee in the universe. If you don't believe me, prove it. Swing by 4501 McPherson and partake of a cup, and then try to say that it is not the best you've ever had. If you find the drive is too long, go to Organic Man Coffee Shop, coffeetrike.shop. Bad coffee leads to bad ideas. Good coffee leads to good ideas. Make ideas great again by drinking the best coffee in the universe. Vic Hermansen has definitely created a tulpa. The creepy little girl, Annabelle Lee, has gotten her hands on a credit card, bought a bunch of new clothes, and she went on vacation. I hope she sends me a postcard. She seems to have left Avalon Leanne Dankworth Smythe in her place, doing all the explaining and straightening out of anything that Vic says wrong while doing the show, Trailer Trash Terrors. Governments don't have any money. Not one red cent. Governments have no way of making money. They don't sell anything. They don't sell anything that belongs to them. The only way they have to get all that cash that they love handing over to other people is by taking it away from you and me. The idea of taxation was to pay for protecting the citizens of the country. Roads and bridges are not built by the U.S. government. They're built by the states. The government takes money from the states and then they give it back to them and pretend like they're helping build bridges and roads. What really is annoying is they take lots of money from one state and then they give a whole bunch of it to another state that isn't paying their share. Not going to mention who this is happening to, but Texas just happens to pay a lot more money to the federal government than they ever get back from them. At no time was our tax money supposed to be sent to other countries to help their citizens. A foreign aid is a scam as far as I'm concerned. The main reason Congress is so quick to shovel enormous piles of money to other countries is then they manage to get all of these gifts back from these countries, things that we would call a bribe. The folks in Washington have lost contract with those of us that they all swore they were going to protect. To support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I took that oath way back in 1985, just before boarding a plane for Fort Knox. I also took it again in 1988 when I joined the U.S. Border Patrol. I still remember what I swore to do back then. Most folks in Washington forget their oath of office right after they say it. As people get elected and move into the great city of iniquity, they quickly become spend happy drunks instead of representatives of we the people. They find out they can become millionaires on a $180,000 a year paycheck. How is this possible, you might ask? Gifts. People give them money. It's better known as bribes, but yeah, they get these huge checks from private companies that want the government to do things for them. The folks in Washington live extravagant lives while you and I are trying to put food on the table. This is known as public service. When a farmer wants to have his herd of cows impregnated, he might rent a bull to service the herd. Yeah, it's kind of the same thing that Washington does. This has been going on as long as written records have been found. Waste is the name of the game. Waste of our money by those people. David Subith sent me a message, and we got to talking about all kinds of strange things. One being the Antarctic snow cruiser. I got my curiosity fired up, and the next thing I knew, I was working on this show. You know how I like to try to make each show an hour long. Since I could only find so much about the cruiser, I filled in the remainder with other but similar stories. Humans have an overly developed curiosity gland. They find some strange new land and they want to see what might be on the far side. They look at the moon and they want to walk on it. They look at the ocean and they decide that they need to dive to the very bottom and see what's down there. Explorers became obsessed with Antarctica shortly after rediscovering it in 1820. The first modern day sighting of mainland Antarctica is attributed to the Russian expedition led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev on the ships Vostok and Mirny on January 28, 1820. Antarctica is shown on a map that was owned by Piri Reis back in 1513, but the boys in the white lab coat don't like to talk about that. There are some folks who tell us Antarctica isn't actually a continent, but a wall that encircles the Earth, which just might be flat. The disk world. It only takes a few years before people begin trying to explore the icy continent. Lots of folks lost their lives hoofing it across the frozen layers of ice and snow, all wanting to be the first to say, I was there. And it only cost most of their toes and fingers. Folks needed a place to set out from, some place they could hopefully come back to later. The first home base set up on the frozen wasteland was 1898 when Karsten Borchgrevink, a Norwegian British explorer, led an expedition to Cape Adare, where he established the first Antarctic base on Ridley Beach. When I say base, I'm not talking about a huge installation with equipment and gear. It was a cabin filled with canned goods in cold weather suits. The cabin would sit vacant for years, awaiting the next bunch of crazy explorers. Don't get me wrong. People willing to boldly go where no man has gone before, try to imagine William Shatner saying that, deserve our respect. But also keep in mind, you have to have a few screws loose to do some of the things that these people were willing to try. Before the start of the Second World War, German aircraft flew about the frozen continent, dropping markers with swastikas attached to them across Queen Maud Land in an attempt to create a territorial claim. Part of this land was called New Swabia. This is one of the areas that Adolf is said to have moved to in order to avoid paying for his criminal activities. The Germans wanted to avoid all that walking around freezing off parts that they thought they might need later on. Most of these crazy folks doing the walking were British or Norwegian. Soon, a bunch of Americans with too much bravado and financed by way of tax dollars wanted in on the action. They set up a base named Little America, which became a series of Antarctic exploration bases from 1929 till 1958. It was located on the Ross Ice Shelf, south of Bay of Whales. Admiral Richard Byrd constructed a series of 5 bases near the Bay of Whales. Boy, he was some kind of a builder, huh? Well, actually, his men constructed these bases, and he stood by looking heroic and got most of the credit. The first base in the series was established January 1929, and it was abandoned in 1930. Little America 2 was established in 1934, some 30 feet above the site of the original base. Because of the constant snowing, the second base was actually above the first one, but 30 feet higher. They dug a tunnel from Little America 2 down to Little America 1 so that the two were connected. This base was briefly set adrift in 1934 when the ice broke free. The iceberg drifted around for a while and then it fused back to another glacier in a different location. Little America 3 was established in 1940, about 6 miles further north. 1943, with Argentina showing too much Nazi activity, the British launched Operation Tabarin to establish a presence on the continent. The British claimed various uninhabited islands and parts of Antarctica. Lieutenant James Marr, in command of a 14-man team, left from the Falkland Islands on board 2 ships. Bases were established during February near the abandoned Norwegian whaling station on Deception Island. That's where another infamous story took place. A second base was set up at Hope Bay in February 1945. Back in 1934, all that walking around on the snow-covered ice was taking a toll on everyone. Frostbite and exhaustion were a constant consideration. What they needed was some kind of a huge machine, like an RV, that could drive through the snow and keep the folks inside warm and comfy. It needed a place for food and beds for sleeping after long days of looking at the snow. Anyone familiar with walking around in cold will also know how much fun going to the bathroom can be in -0 degree temperatures. It's not fun at all. Keep in mind, this was 8 years before the U.S. got involved in World War II. 35 years before, well, maybe longer, before the first man set foot on the moon. Admiral Byrd had spent time in the Antarctica, and he knew the dangers involved in exploring. He had flown over the South Pole, and he hadn't seen any polar bears, which isn't all that unusual because polar bears don't live in the southern hemisphere. Knowing how far it was between the coast and the pole, Byrd began looking for some means of traversing all that ice other than by foot. Flying was great until you saw something that you needed to take a closer look at. The planes they used did come equipped with skis, so they could land, but the terrain they were looking at was not something you wanted to use unless there just wasn't any choice. Huge pressure ridges were everywhere. Add to this, there were snow caves unseen from the air that a landing plane just might catch a ski in, leading to a crash. What Byrd wanted was some kind of a vehicle that was able to drive over or through these pressure ridges and if it chanced over an unseen cave, it needed to be capable of driving right on out. The crew would need to be able to fix any and all broken parts miles from the nearest gas station. And so the vehicle would need a machine shop built in and ready at a moment's notice. The crew would need a whole warehouse full of spare parts that was carried along with all the rest of the gear needed to survive for weeks in the frozen landscape. Byrd's second in command, Dr. Thomas Poulter, returned from the Antarctic expedition with ideas for this massive, purpose built transport vehicle for Antarctic exploration. It was envisioned as an unstoppable machine for long distance travel on the continent's endless snow and ice. It would have to be designed to withstand the harsh weather conditions and to be comfortable enough to do scientific experiments and relax once in a while for about a year. It would need lots of storage room. April 29, 1939, Poulter and the Research Foundation of the Armor Institute of Technology showed the plans to officials in Washington, D.C. The foundation would finance the Antarctic snow cruiser at an approximate cost of $150,000, which is about $3,390,000 today. The second most expensive motorhome ever built was the 2012 Element Palazzo Superior from Marchi Mobile at just over $3 million. But it did not come equipped with a machine shop or a laboratory. Work began on the snow cruiser August 8, 1939, in Chicago, of all places, and it took them 11 weeks. A part of the design included long overhangs at either end, as well as retractable wheels that would assist in getting unstuck. In the Border Patrol, you were only considered stuck if you needed help getting unstuck. The machine was 55 feet long, 15 feet wide. It weighed 45,000 pounds empty. It was designed to house 4 to 5 people for a year with all the food, fuel, and equipment they might need. It had a 2,500 gallon diesel capacity. Don't you just know it? There are conflicting stories on how much fuel the snow cruiser was to carry. Some say they had a 5,000 gallon diesel tank, and that was just for the machine to use. It also carried an additional 1,000 gallons for the airplane. Airplane? Oh, yes, there was going to be an airplane, but I'll get to that in a minute or two. The whole amount of all that fuel would be 42,000 pounds. That's just in diesel. Add to the 45,000 pounds of the machine, you're looking at 87,000 pounds. The snow cruiser had a science lab, a photography darkroom, an engine room, a small machine shop. Its wheels were 10 feet in diameter and they weighed 700 pounds each. The tires were made from special type of rubber that would not break or crumble in the extreme cold. Each wheel could be steered independently with its own motor, a system that would allow the snow cruiser to navigate difficult terrain or cross 15-foot crevices. The vehicle was designed for an average speed of 1 to 13 miles an hour, with a maximum speed of 30 miles an hour. While exploring, the crew would more than likely have reason to look at landscape and places the snow cruiser just couldn't get to. They also might have need of evacuating a member of the crew if some unforeseen accident or illness. So the upper deck was designed to carry a small airplane. The plane came equipped with a diesel engine, so it could be refueled from the snow cruiser's tanks. In the 1930s, one of the best known diesel airplane engines was the Junkers Jumo Series 2 stroke. These engines had the unique design of having two pistons in each cylinder. They were large and flat, and they were used on the Junkers Ju-86P reconnaissance aircraft and the six-engine Blohm and Voss BV-222 Viking flying boat. The snow cruiser was way too short for a plane to take off from, so the plane would be hoisted off the top deck using a small crane and set down in the snow. The two-man crew could take off and do their recon, and then land back and be loaded back on the machine. The snow cruiser could accommodate a crew of 5. The machine was huge until you filled it up with all the equipment needed for a 1-year drive. Having to look at and talk to the same 4 people besides yourself every day for 365 days, you'd better be in good terms with them and have a real good ability to get along with others. The interior was cramped, and if you wanted to step outside, you'd better put on some warm stuff. Lots of warm stuff. Up front in an elevated control room sat the snow cruiser's driver and navigator. Not only were they, cue in William Shatner's voice, boldly going where no man had gone before, they were making maps as they went of the terrain for future expeditions. Underneath the control room, beneath a catwalk, were the machine shop, snow melter, and a variety of generators, pumps, and hoists. Just ahead of the front wheels was the engine room, housing a pair of Cummins inline-6 diesel engines that combined for 300 horsepower. The engines were paired with 2 generators and 4 electric motors, courtesy of General Electric, which also combined for 300 horsepower. The cruiser ran on a diesel electric motor, just like a freight train. Behind the front wheels were the photo darkroom and galley, followed by the crew's living and sleeping quarters. In the area near the rear wheels, you'd find the storeroom. Way in the back was a storage compartment for 2 spare tires. October 24th, 1939, the vehicle was fired up for the first time at Pullman Company just south of Chicago, and from there, various drivers took the newly built vehicle across the Midwest. They made test drives on sand dunes along Lake Michigan in northern Indiana, and then they drove across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. As it crossed the nation, roads were closed to traffic because the vehicle required both lanes. It's 15 feet wide. This created massive traffic jams and also drew crowds of onlookers. No one had ever seen anything like it. A gigundous motor vehicle that dwarfed everything around it. Most folks knew what a car looked like, but this was nothing like it. This was a monster. I have to ask, who was the mental midget that gave the construction contract to Chicago Company? The Pullman Company was 1,020 miles from Boston. Once the machine was ready, it would have to be driven from the middle of the country to the coast before being loaded on a ship to be transported to the Antarctica. You mean to tell me there were no plants anywhere near the coast that could build an enormous motorhome? Chicago is right next to Lake Michigan, and the snow cruiser could have been loaded on a barge and hauled to the coast, but I get the impression the folks in charge wanted a photo op, or actually thousands of photo ops, and they intentionally had the machine driven across half the country to show off their creation. Somebody should have seen the writing on the wall, but everybody wanted to ignore it. Admiral Byrd's team should have heeded the warnings as this shakedown trip progressed, or didn't progress. There had to be somebody watching who noticed the giant vehicle was not up to the intended mission. Despite the police escort, the snow cruiser got hit by a truck in Indiana. Later on, it suffered fuel pump troubles. The engines stopped running. It had to be fixed, and it had to have parts shipped from Chicago to fix it. 6 miles outside of Lima, Ohio, they hit a bridge, and then they fell off the road into a small creek. It remained there for 3 days before it could get unstuck. Its unstoppable cruiser had so many problems just crossing the United States. How in the world was it supposed to cross the Antarctic? The snow cruiser did eventually reach Boston, Massachusetts, and it departed for the Antarctica on November 15th, 1939, aboard the U.S. Coast Guard cutter North Star. None of the public could agree on what to call the thing. Nobody had ever told the newspapers what it was named, so they just started calling it the Penguin, or the Penguin 1, and sometimes the Turtle. The snow cruiser arrived at Little America in the Bay of Whales, Antarctica, with the United States Antarctic Service Expedition in early January 1940, and then they experienced just a few more minor glitches. Just a few. Things the designers and the builders never took into account. Things like, how do you get a 45,000-pound vehicle off the deck of a Coast Guard cutter? Little America didn't have any cranes to lift the craft from the ship to shore. Why nobody standing there in Boston watching the snow cruiser being loaded ever asked, do they have cranes in Antarctica as well? It was necessary to construct a ramp from timbers to unload the vehicle. As the vehicle was unloaded from the ship, one of the wheels broke through the ramp. 45,000 pounds is a lot to put on a few wooden beams. Dr. Polter was at the controls, and he managed to power the vehicle free from the ramp. The crowd went wild. They cheered, knowing with the vehicle moving on its own, they wouldn't have to do more work trying to get it unloaded. The cheers fell silent as the snow cruiser drove into the snow and stopped cruising. The snow cruiser was stuck in the first snow it encountered. The boys in the white lab coats had designed the cruiser's tires to drive through a swamp. There was no tread, just smooth rubber faces. The machine couldn't get any purchase on the snow or ice underneath. Instead of moving over the snow, the machine began to sink into the stuff it was designed to drive over. The snow cruiser was more like a snow sinker. Once the machine was about 3 feet down, it did stop descending once it hit the ice. Thinking what they needed was more tire surface to keep the machine on top of the snow, the crew attached the 2 spare tires to the front wheels of the vehicle. So far, so good. To make up for the bald-faced tires, they attached chains to the rear tires, and they prayed that this would do the job. The chained tires spun, and the ensuing heat began to melt the ice. things were not going according to plan. This sounds very much like a lot of government projects where the folks in charge are all sitting behind desks while all the work is being done. True, Byrd and Poulter started the project, but the vast majority of the design was by people who never worked outside an office. If you've never been stuck, one trick we used was to rock the vehicle back and forth. You put it in drive and give it the gas, or fuel, since the machine was diesel, and you move as far forward as you can get. As soon as you move a few inches, you put it in reverse and you move back over your own tracks. You next put it in drive and move forward again. Each time you shift, you hope the move of a few more inches until momentum, forward and backwards, gets you up and out of the hole that you have found yourself in. The crew tried unstucking the machine by moving forwards and backwards. They didn't have any other machine that could tow the monster or even help get it out of its predicament. The snow cruiser was supposed to be able to climb over pressure ridges, but it was so underpowered it had difficulty getting over a 3-foot snow pile. The snow cruiser did finally get out of the hole, going backwards. The machine made better progress going in reverse. Ground guides had to walk along behind the vehicle and relay directions to the driver who couldn't see where he was going. The longest distance covered was 92 miles, driven completely in reverse. Any time they tried going forwards, the snow cruiser got stuck again. The whole process of getting unstuck had to be done all over again. Imagine being one of the poor suckers that had to walk that 92 miles as a ground guide for this giant machine. I wonder what the topic of discussion was that night over dinner. Hey, you think we can drive to the South Pole in reverse? Maybe. January 24th, 1940, Poulter returned to the United States, leaving Alton Wade in charge of a partial crew. I wonder who was the first person to say, "This thing is a total waste of money." Well, it was. The intended mission was for the machine to drive around the Antarctic and to be safe haven for 5 crewmen inside. Instead, it needed the entire assembled members of the base station just to get a few feet through the snow. The snow cruiser was essentially a total failure, a white elephant, if you will. It started right out the gate with a total lack of traction. With the underpowered engines, could barely turn in the frigid conditions. The vehicle wound up being used as a base station, and the scientificking had to be done walking around in the ice and snow, freezing off fingers and toes. One design that did work was the engine's coolant was being pumped through the cabin structure, heating the snow cruiser's interior despite the brutal, frigid conditions outside. The scientists conducted seismographical experiments, cosmic ray measurements, and ice core sampling while living in the snow cruiser that was slowly being added to. The crew used wood to build additions to the sides so that more work could be done in relative comfort of the warmth. Poulter wanted to return to Antarctica and outfit the vehicle with improved parts. But when the U.S. became entangled in World War II, the government focused its funding on the war effort. The Arctic snow cruiser was abandoned at Little America 3 base December 22nd, 1940. Such a sad ending to a hugely publicized mission. We're going to drive to the South Pole. Oh, well, we're going to use this $3 million RV as a cabin. They could have built a heck of a big cabin for $3 million. This was not the end of the snow cruiser. Wait, there's more. During Operation High Jump in the late 1946, an expedition team found the vehicle and they discovered that it needed air in the tires and a little bit of servicing to get it fired up. For the one or two of y'all that might not have listened to Operation High Jump from December 2021, it was officially known as the United States Navy Antarctic Development Program 1946 to 1947. It was a significant United States Navy mission initiated shortly after World War II. The official primary objective was to establish the Antarctic Research Base known as Little America 4. This 2-year operation, also referred to Task Force 68, commenced on August 26, 1946, and concluded February 1947. The expedition involved 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, and 33 airplanes. As soon as the fleet arrived, strange things began to take place. Flying discs with Nazi emblems emerged from the ocean and began shooting at the ships. Men and equipment were lost. The whole 2-year mission was scrapped after only a few months. The snow cruiser was once more left to the elements as the U.S. Navy headed back home without accomplishing their mission. The best laid plans of mice went astray. No, I did not misquote that. If you've never read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you should. Stop listening right now and go read the book, and then when you finish the book, you can come back and listen to the rest of the show. Yes, it's the best laid plans of mice often go astray. 1958, an international expedition uncovered the snow cruiser at Little America 3 by using a bulldozer. It was covered by 23 feet of snow, and somebody had left a long bamboo pole marking its position. I wonder where did they get the bamboo from? It doesn't grow down there. A bamboo isn't the usual kind of thing that you have on an equipment list when you're packing for the Antarctica. Every single item used on that frozen continent has to be shipped, including water. You'd think it would be easy to melt snow and drink it, but no. The amount of fuel needed to melt enough snow to make drinking water is prohibitive. It's cheaper and easier to just ship water down there instead of trying to make it. Antarctica's icy landscape is actually the largest desert in the world. In contrast to other types of desert, polar deserts contain vast amounts of water in the form of ice and snow. In fact, the Antarctic ice sheet contains 70% of the Earth's fresh water. That's a lot of drinking water. This water isn't readily accessible to plants and animals, and this contributes to the barren landscape found in these deserts. The folks who found the snow cruiser were able to excavate down to the bottom of the wheels and accurately measure the amount of snowfall since it was abandoned. Inside the vehicle was exactly as the crew had left it. Papers, magazines, and cigarettes strewn about the cabin. Back then, people were told by doctors that smoking was good for you. Old sea rations used to come with cigarettes. Later expeditions to the area were unable to find the snow cruiser. Many began to speculate that the Soviets had taken it back to Moscow as some kind of a publicity stunt. The machine was abandoned for all intents and purposes, but it was U.S. government property and not open to salvage rights. The Soviets never admitted to having the snow cruiser, and there were never any photographs or newspaper reports of such a huge Soviet windfall. We found an abandoned RV, and now it is ours. I don't do a good Russian. I don't do a good uh, accent of anybody for that matter. Although there were unsubstantiated speculation that the tractionless snow cruiser was taken by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the vehicle most likely is either at the bottom of the Southern Ocean or buried deep under snow and ice. Antarctic ice is a constant motion, and the ice shelf is constantly moving out to sea. The Antarctic station, known as Little America 1 through 3, were all built on an ice shelf. There was no solid ground under them. Weather being what it is, the ice shelf would break and some of the base would find themselves adrift on the ocean. I can hear the planners now. What can possibly go wrong? One theory going around is that the snow cruiser was last seen at Little America 3, and the base broke loose, drifted away, taking the giant motorhome with it. Either the snow cruiser is still on the ice and it wound up bumped up against some other part of the Antarctic, or it went out to sea and sank. The $3 million motorhome became a habitat for fish. The folks in charge had no incentive to do anything along the lines of, let's try to save this thing, because they weren't footing the bill. If we could somehow get the folks spending our money on these projects to have to pay for their mistakes, kind of like how we all have to pay for ours, maybe they wouldn't be so free with the budgeting. It sure would be nice if politicians had to reimburse the Treasury every time they did a wasteful scheme. Back when I worked for a living, we had to take training classes on regular basis involving computer security. The sight was so bad it made grown men cry and women faint. The graphics were something from a kindergarten, and the dialogue was from a certain politician's speeches, only not nearly as entertaining. The whole intent of the training was to keep our computer information safe from hackers. The company sent me a letter a few years ago saying that they had been hacked, and all my private information may have been compromised. Good thing I was already retired and none of my information was valid anymore. See, it says right there, retired. The people in charge of our training had no idea what it was that we were doing, or what they were doing for that matter. We had to take an active shooter class one day to keep us safe from some would-be killer who might sneak into our station. Our building, with 95% of the personnel being armed. The instructions were hide under our desks and pray that somebody arrived in time to save our lives. This went against everything we had been taught up to that point about public safety. We had been taught to use deadly force to keep ourselves or an innocent third party alive. Now the folks in charge were telling us to hide and don't get involved if somebody is shooting up the building. Nobody could pass the final test because we all said we would try to engage the active shooter and defuse the situation. This was the wrong answer as far as the clowns who developed the course were concerned. What really blew my mind was someone, somewhere, must have said, wait a minute, these people are armed and trained to respond. Nope. They all just signed off on the training and it was sent out to the stations. It's the old one size fits all when it comes to bizarre government training, and the company probably made millions for it. Way back before I worked for the government, I was in construction. There was a guy, Wally, who we shared a birthday. We were both born on April 8th. only several years apart. He had been in the Navy during the Vietnam War, but somehow never got sent into country. He did his time and was discharged. The first job he was able to land was working for a barge company. They were contracted by the government to haul a huge barge from the West Coast over to Vietnam. For unknown reasons, the folks over there needed this huge barge. It was supposed to be critical for the war effort. They were mid-Pacific when a storm caught them and the barge sprung a seam and it began to sink. The crew had to enter the leaking compartment and seal it while the barge was being flung about in the storm and water was up over their waists. Through sheer stubbornness, they were able to save the barge and deliver it to the Navy. Once, just off the shore of Vietnam, the tugboat was directed to move the barge to a site somewhere along the shoreline of the Tonkin Gulf. As the tug was about to push the barge into place, there was a huge explosion. An underwater mine had detonated and the barge sunk in a matter of minutes. The tug crew turned around and headed back to the U.S. Why did they need a barge shipped over from this side of the ocean is a matter of debate. It probably belonged to some relative of the government official that had bought it. Once it was at the bottom of the Gulf, that much needed plan for it was scrapped. The Navy decided they didn't need a replacement and they went on to do other things. Remember back when the government decided that we all had to buy health insurance? On our taxes, we had to prove that we had coverage. If not, we would be fined for not having a commodity that the government isn't supposed to have an interest in. I looked. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say, well, it might say that somewhere, but nowhere does it say, thou shalt have health care coverage. It is unconstitutional, but what do I know? To help those folks who didn't have health insurance, the government rolled out a website to assist. It was called healthcare.com and it was so wonderful. All you needed to do was open the site and browse all the coverage in the area and then buy what you needed. It was so easy, a caveman. No, wait, that's a different company. Right off the bat, the site was screwed up. Nobody could browse anything without first creating a user profile. You had to enter your name, address, any existing healthcare issues, a credit card number so that when you were done buying something, you could pay for it. And the whole thing was not user friendly. It was designed by a committee. It had been designed by several different computer programmers who didn't have any contact with each other. One person was programming the way the site would look, while another was making the buttons that would take you to some website that may or may not have anything to do with healthcare. To add to the confusion, the site wasn't nearly finished when they opened it to the public. Kind of like going on a boat or a cruise ship that they're still building. Thousands, more like millions of people, all flooded the site trying to get insurance all at once. The server was not nearly big enough, and the site crashed shortly after opening. I've had to visit government websites. Being retired from the government, I have to log in and download documents or upload status. The folks doing the programming are the computer guys that couldn't get a job working at the Geek Squad. They have all kinds of links to all kinds of things that I am not looking for or ever would need. They offer help if I'll just open a chat box and ask the friendly computer that doesn't speak English, well, how to find what I'm looking for. The computer must have been programmed by some guy in a mud hut in Timbuktu. I type in a question, then I wait a while to get an answer that has nothing to do with what I'm asking. Confidential reports from the Health and Human Services Department said that senior officials repeatedly expressed doubts that the computer system for the Federal Exchange would be ready on time, blaming delayed regulations, a lack of resources, and other factors. Things like the programmers not having contact with each other was also mentioned. The U.S. government spent more than $80 billion each year for this information technology service. Yet the resulting system took years to build and was cumbersome when it was launched. Error messages, long waits, and other problems with healthcare.gov were the normal outcome instead of the odd thing. Instead of going back to the old way of doing things, the government threw more money at the problem. More computer techs were put into the system while the problems were being mostly ignored. It was like putting more tape on a broken hose without ever replacing the damaged part. They were also being spotlighted as a high profile nature of its launch and unexpectedly heavy demand. Who could have foreseen this? Tell everybody in the United States they have got to buy health care coverage and then have a website that can only handle a few dozen people at a time. Yeah, that's kind of typical these days. They're doing construction outside on some cable company is installing a fiber optic line, but it's not my company. The federal IT crisis is a complex system of regulations that rewards contractors that are better at bidding on giant federal contracts than at building software. Instead of learning how to get computers to work, they focus on figuring out how to get the contracts, who to give gifts to. Once the checks are signed, they get busy trying to figure out how to program a computer after the fact. Think of it this way. You go to school to learn how to get hired to do a job without learning any skills needed to do the job. Oh, wait a second. That sounds like most public schools. They teach kids how to pass tests instead of how to think up answers. Government contracts are usually awarded to the lowest bidder. And there are very few penalties, if any at all, for not finishing the job. There are also a number of extra requirements that government contracts that make state of the art Silicon Valley style developments impossible for the scale of government projects. They expect huge rewards while paying minimum costs. Once the paperwork is signed, something called cost overruns comes into play. $1 billion project handed over to the lowest bidder will soon surpass the highest bidder's requirements as actual dollar amounts fly out of control. The guys in charge of the money in Washington simply hand over more money because the first check has already been cashed and it would be too expensive to start over. To add more fuel to this dumpster fire, citizens were on a time constraint to have insurance or pay a fine. People were trying to log on, and this was adding too many users to an already jammed up system. As the computer folks were trying to fix the website, fake companies began to pop up that looked just like healthcare.gov. People not knowing the difference were being scammed out of thousands of dollars, logging into fake sites and handing over all their personal information. As these sites were being discovered by the authorities, they would quickly shut down and reopen using a different address. The folks being scammed never got their money back. The secure The security of healthcare.com was also handed over to the lowest bidder. It didn't take long for hackers to get in and begin messing with the programs as the IT guys were trying to shovel it out. In an effort to fix the dumpster fire website, the IT guys began using copywritten programs from other companies. This led to many lawsuits popping up all over the place. Once everything had been said and done, the number of people out there who still have no health insurance is about the same. The taxpayers are out several $billion, and the whole thing is still a smoldering fire that no one is willing to put out. The founding fathers were all businessmen. They all had run companies or farms, and they all knew how to do things. They had people around them that could answer questions on how things worked and how to fix problems. Today, we have folks in position of power that all they have ever done is go to college and learn how to talk without saying anything. Once elected, they focus on how to become millionaires while surrounding themselves with people that tell them what a wonderful job they're doing while keeping all the ugly facts away. If they should make a huge mistake, there are no consequences. They get somebody else to take a fall, and then they go on looking for the next huge mistake to finance so they can slip a few tax dollars into their own pockets. Next time folks are lining up to cast their votes for somebody just 'cause they like the way they dress, maybe they should look at it this way. The United States is a multi-billion-dollar company that we all own, sort of. We're going to hire someone to run this company for us. Do you want some nut job handling your retirement in the future that is only looking out for themselves? Or do you want to hire someone who has your best interests in mind? If I mismanage my money, it costs me dearly. If Congress mismanages my money, there are no consequences. We should change that. If every politician that voted for some failed project had to take that out of their retirement, had to pay for it out of their bank account, we wouldn't have a multi-trillion-dollar deficit today. We would have a huge pile of cash in our own savings accounts. Had those folks in Washington back in 1940 been forced to pay for that $3 million motorhome out of their own pockets, that only drove 92 miles backwards, the folks making decisions today would look back at that and say, better be careful with that money. Those citizens that we represent, they want action. How about making all those folks pay for that failed website? Knowing their retirements were on the line, don't you think they would have gotten IT folks who actually knew what they were doing instead of hiring their buddies and offering them billion-dollar contracts just 'cause they look good in a suit or they talked well in front of the committee? Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, spread it around to tell other people that they should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And sometimes they get really strange, and other times they're just a little strange. If you'd like to support the show, you can buy one of my books, or you can buy several of them. You can go to Amazon.com and get the Laredo Paranormal Research Society, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, Paranormal Laredo, Paranormal Stories, and my latest book that is just called UFOs. I couldn't come up with a snappy name for it. UFOs and the Paranormal? Paranormal UFOs? No, that doesn't sound good, so I just went with UFOs. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
coming to the tree, where there strung up a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.